We're now live, Chair.
Right, thanks, Ellie. Thank you. So, item 6, which is the Strategic Asset Management Plan, SAMP. So, over to Sue.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chair. The portfolio holder, Councillor John Isaac, had hoped to be here this evening but was unable to attend. So I'm going to introduce the report and then I'll hand over to Martin Jones, who'll take you through some of the specific details. So the purpose of this report is to seek for the committee's comments for Cabinet on the Strategic Asset Management Plan, which I'm going to refer to as SAMP as we go forward, so I don't have to keep saying it. And it's attached as Appendix 1 to the report. And what it does is it gives an overview of the Council's property assets and gives an update on progress since the 2017 property investment strategy, and against which the acquisitions were completed in 2020. The 2017 property investment strategy is effectively completed and now part of business as usual.
Have we lost Sue?
The property investment strategy years 22-23. Oh, nobody hear me?
Yeah, you just cut out for about 5 seconds.
Okay. So the SAMP aims to set out a forward vision on the council for the council for 22-23 all the way through to 25-26, and it covers the investment properties, operational properties, regeneration properties, and also includes the annual property plan for 22-23. So the information is provided in appendices 1 to 3 of the SAMP, and it gives a high-level summary of each category within the contents of the report. It is intended that the SAMP and associated specific detailed strategies will lead to an improvement plan, which will detail and monitor as part of the annual property plan itself. And it should be noted that whilst approval is being sought at this time for the annual property plan by council as part of the SAMP, going forward, as is normal practice, that will actually come to Audit and Accounts Committee prior to going to Cabinet for approval each year. It's just because we're resetting it as part of the overall SAMP that it's all going to council this year. So the SAMP is key in supporting the council's objectives and priorities of delivering its frontline services. I'm sure you're all aware that it makes about 1/3 of our actual income for the council. And we will aim to achieve efficiencies and improvements on the operational portfolio, whilst targeting to improve revenue resilience on the investment portfolio. Assets that are held for regeneration purposes will deliver outputs and outcomes which assist the inward investment in the economy in Basingstoke, as well as improvements in communities in line with the business case-led approach. The plan builds on the work of previous years, but actually looks at more active asset management. And for anyone that was actually on the committee previously, we have continued to report in the last couple of years how we need to move to and set up the Strategic Asset Management Plan, which we haven't had previously. So as I say, it includes the updated property investment strategy. And whilst forming part of the Strategic Asset Management Plan, the property investment strategy actually forms part of the capital strategy or the capital investment strategy, which is later on the agenda for this committee tonight. So whilst the overall aim of this new strategy is to maintain the current overall level of property investment, so one of the things we're very keen to do is the 2017 property investment strategy actually increased the overall amount of investment that we had in property. The current, or the one that's coming forward for approval, actually seeks to maintain the overall level of property investment, but seeks to actually get the assets to work harder. So there are a number of opportunities that have been identified working with the strategic advisors at JLL. And the idea is to try and generate improved long-term sustainable revenue by both working the existing capital asset base, and that may be through disposals or regearing of leases, or by making new property investments from the capital sums that have been generated from those disposals or regearing. And there's some key aims and objectives of the strategy. So obviously it is clearly to improve the revenue returns, look to diversify the asset base to reduce overall volatility and position for growth. We really need to modernise the estate and improve the lot sizes. We want to enhance the overall sustainability credentials of the portfolio towards net zero carbon, and we want to stimulate economic regeneration within the Basingstoke area. So to progress this strategy, the capital programme update and strategy report is all going to council in February, and it seeks to make further investments of £40 million in this new property investment strategy. But as I've said, the £40 million gets added into the capital programme, but it is funded by disposals of assets before we repurchase them. So it's basically a self-funding strategy. And so that was all I was going to say in terms of an introduction. So I can either answer any questions linked to that, or I can hand over to Martin, who will now take through some of the detail.
Are we happy to let Martin carry on from here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Welcome, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as Sue said, we've sort of carried out a thorough review of the portfolio. We appointed JLL after a tender exercise last year to review the assets. The asset base of just under 300 million on the investment portfolio side does need modernising. So we continue to sort of grow the revenue base. We've also put a big focus in on the operational property as well to identify revenue opportunities there and surplus assets. So that will be running hand in hand with investment, although slightly different sort of delegation and processes to should we decide to dispose of any assets. We do own a lot of smaller assets which take a lot of sort of management time, and some of those assets as well overlap with a lot of the regeneration projects, and the regenerations projects, which are the town centre strategy, the leisure park, and sort of Basin View to a degree, all have very different drivers from a regeneration sort of viewpoint, and need to adapt where they hold investment properties within those areas to sort of the goals and outputs and the business plan which would be done for those regeneration projects at the time. A key theme running through everything is sustainability. From the operational properties where we pay energy bills, we've got energy audits being carried out in the next few months. We are also on the investment properties. When we buy an investment assets, we've got minimum criteria and sustainability that those assets need to hit, as well as performance indices on yield. Yes, there's a big job ahead. A big area where we can actually get latent value from the existing assets are some of the long leasehold interests, where we can sort of re-gear. By that, I mean where there's sort of a lease and maybe it's got 150 years, but only it's 50 years and expired. We extend those leases for premium. We've recently done one of those on Basin View, and received a receipt of £500,000. And we also aim to use our leverage with those companies on sustainability issues, where there's very much a joint aim of sort of improving standards. I think that's a sort of a quick sort of canter through. We very heavily sort of industrial based on our sort of portfolio, which has stood up well through the turbulent times. We've also got the portfolios defined by a lot of long leasehold interests, which are very safe from an investment point of view. If we want to move up the risk curve and get better returns, then direct investment is the preferred, could be the preferred route. Also diversification to look at other sorts of investments as well, such as the life sciences, perhaps private rented sector housing, and a whole host of sort of new opportunities that are out there, and making the most of the sort of 5G network that is going into sort of Basin View. So we're focusing on those sorts of areas. Also, we have sort of land holdings close to Buckskins and Winklebury, where we're working with the registered providers to sort of look at what we can do from a property perspective and what returns we can get. So that's a quick counter through. I don't know if anyone's got any questions.
Members. Councillor Tilbury.
Oh, hello. Yeah, the one that sort of jumped out at me on here and looking at it was Atwood Close. I mean, I remember the last time they considered trying to sell that off, and it was an absolute fiasco. You know, we even ended up with David Cameron getting involved in it, you know, with the Park Owned Residents Association.
Yeah.
So they were patron. Oh, what are we considering there? You know, surely we're not going to go down that road again, because that was an absolute nightmare. We had it caused a considerable amount of distress to the residents, unsurprisingly, and there was no clear way of doing it. So can we have some clarity on that? You know, just sticking it in the report was a bit worrying. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Certainly. It's an asset that doesn't sit well in the sort of property portfolio. We're not mobile park sort of specialists. The Atwood Close itself is protected by the Mobile Parks Act, and can't be developed. The residents are quite sort of safe under their tenancies. They're protected by law, and so is the rent that they pay, and under the terms of their lease. It is one we're looking at amongst others, and we've got a list of sort of interchangeable assets which can be sort of swapped around as well, so we can hit all receipt targets.
Okay. In the absence, Councillor James.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just couldn't stand the silence, to be honest. I think, I was reading through it, and I know when we set up the property investment fund previously, one of the biggest drawbacks was, as a council, when there's a great opportunity, the pension companies, the property investors would turn up 20 minutes later with a check. We were still drafting our third report to go to the second committee to set up a map to look at the issue and report back to council in 12 years' time, by which time the property had been bought, sold 3 times and fallen down. And so we had to move a little bit faster. And I think that's right. And from what I can see, the Property Investment Board and the ability for the relevant senior officers to be delegated to make decisions on acquisitions, I think makes sense, because sometimes opportunities present themselves. You move quickly, you report back.
Yeah.
What concerns me more is around disposals, given that, and I think Councillor Tilby raises an excellent point, from a desktop exercise, from a JAL brought in to look at the performance of our property point of view, there will be properties that you think, why the hell have you got that? But actually, there's a social reason, there's a sensitivity around it, that we hold it because we're not a property investment company, we're not a pension fund, we're a local authority with a responsibility primarily to look after, protect and improve the well-being of our residents. We make some money on the side because we have to fund that activity, but our primary activity is the well-being of our residents. It's not property. So everything we do in property is about supporting that. And sometimes that means holding properties. Otherwise, you'd never own a community centre, would you? Because they make bugger all. It just costs money every so often, but they're really important to the communities they serve. So how do we make sure that there's no risk that property will be disposed of, or we'll start entering into negotiations with somebody else about disposing of a property without a process that we go through where the people who get the emails from the residents, which is generally us, are consulted fully? I wouldn't like, even if a cabinet member involved, I'm sure, my knowledge of Overton is not great. So if I was a cabinet member in charge of this, I'm sure Ian Tilbury would panic like hell. The idea of a councillor who's been through Overton twice is making a decision over a property we might hold there. So it's really important. Where's the democratic accountability for disposals built into the process?
Do you want to pick that one up?
I will do. Apologies. I think my connection is really poor, so I'll keep going. If I cut out, I'll try and repeat myself. It's worth noting that in the governance that's suggested, that only relates to those properties that are held for investment purposes. So obviously we hold a number of properties under different powers for different reasons, and the delegations being sought for officers only relate to investment activity. What I would say is that there are some assets that clearly would be could possibly be held as investment properties, but in those instances, because we will be bringing the list, if you like, back to Audit Accounts Committee on a regular basis as we monitor the annual property plan. Obviously, we'll have an opportunity to obviously brief members on what's currently on the list for consideration. So we get, and obviously an early heads up in terms of any potential issues that people want to discuss. But I think more importantly, it doesn't matter whether it's the disposals and officer delegation or whether it's still going to go through cabinet or council, depending on what type of property it is. We still have to do full consultation. So there'll be a full consultation with members, ward members, etc., before any decisions are made. So it will go through a complete due diligence, but there are, as I say, only those delegations only relate purely to those properties that are held for investment purposes. They're not intended to deal with the likes of Swan Street and Atwood Close, etc.
Councillor McCormick.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question and aligned with it, a statement for Cabinet, because I think we are supposed to be feeding forward comments to Cabinet. Looking at the table that starts on page 97, you have a very long list of community centres and buildings there, and they all have EPC ratings where we're aspiring to be A or B, and some of them are F or G.
Yeah.
We have stated, as a council, we've declared a climate emergency. We have stated that we're going to be a carbon neutral council by 2025. That's just under 3 years away. It seems a hell of a lot of work to do for all these buildings. And okay, so we have an energy rating, but it doesn't really give an indication as to how close these buildings are to being carbon neutral or not. So one of the questions I have is, where are we going to get the money to get there? My statement to Cabinet is, we need to get there because we have pledged that we will do that. And it's not just the reputation of the council that's at stake. It is the climate, it's the future of the world that's at stake. And, we've signed up to some really tough targets, and it appears that we've got a hell of a lot of work to do to get there.
Yes, I agree. It is exceptionally tough sort of challenge. We're making a start now. There are grants out there to assist us in the decarbonisation plan, and we'll be intending to apply to all we can as and when the opportunities to do works to these buildings come up. To give an example of sort of works, when we repair a roof, we not only do that, we'll be aiming to do the insulation, but that will put the costs up, and I think that's got to be recognised. And when we come into the detail of looking at these individual buildings, do we put ground source heat pumps? Do we replace the sort of existing heating? I think that goes all in the mix and the ask.
I have a supplemental, if I may, Chair. I mean, do we have any indication as to how how long it's going to take, how close are we to achieving this 2025 goal. It's difficult to infer that from the table. All I see is lots of red and lots of D+ energy ratings. I mean, it's going to cost millions, but what's the likelihood of us getting this money and actually, we need to get this money in the next year, and then we've got to actually do the work.
Some of the money is already in the planned and preventative maintenance process for some of the assets, and yes, additional money will be needed, but the sort of bulk of it in some cases will be there. But we have just got to, it is a government initiative, and funding will, we've been told, will be available.
Okay, I've just got one question, if I may, in the absence of others. Oh, sorry, Sue, you've got your hand up. Have you got a comment to make on what has just been said?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to note really that the intention is over the next 12 months or so is to actually look at what the decarbonisation plan might be for each of those buildings, not to necessarily have done it in the next year. And as Martin said, we will look to understand what the cost of these activities are. But we also need to look at some of those buildings we may not hold going forward. So, for example, we've got parklands on there. We need to obviously understand how that fits into the town centre strategy. Some of the community centres will be very much dependent on the community strategy. So we're recognising that these are properties that we need to actively do something about. And obviously, yes, hopefully grant funding will be available. But if we need to bring back requests, it will be capital funding requests. But obviously, we need to establish what those requests are first.
Yeah, if I may. So some of these, Parklands has mentioned, that's actually one of the better buildings according to the table. That's a B-rated building. But I wouldn't like to think that as a council, we might be doing a bit of a cop-out, disposing of carbon heavy assets for some poor other body to pick up, the buyer to pick up. I think it's incumbent on us to address these issues. But even some of the better ones have got comments like, as an example, Maidenwell Pavilion, efficient but high gas usage. Brighton Hill Pavilion, efficient but high gas usage. We've got a lot of other things that we need to do, even with some of the relatively good EPC ratings. So while I take on board that we won't be doing it next year, I think we've got to get our skates on identifying the source of funding, because if we leave identifying the source of funding to the next year, then we've only got 1 year to actually implement things. And I think it will take at least a year to implement these things, getting plans together, availability of materials, all the rest of it. We've got to get a move on.
Councillor Putty.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, I have got a question. I hope I am on the same paper with regards to at 3.5, where we got closer working with community team. And again, this one is to do with section 106. There is a backlog of outstanding lease renewal on community buildings to address. And my question is, what about, have we secured all the section 106 that we are entitled to, and why there is such a backlog?
On the quantum of sort of 106 sort of money and spent, I think if Sue can perhaps sort of comment on that. But with regard to the sort of backlog of the leases, that's primarily due to historical reasons of getting our community strategy right and how we want to set up the sort of various community groups, and they're not all the same, and they need a bit of a bespoke approach in some cases. But but 106 does provide a significant part of providing community assets.
And is it the 106 is specific for the area that it is covering?
They're usually quite specific, relating to the developments that occur and quite often adjoin or in close proximity to those, with a defined sort of use with the developer.
So you look as if you're going to contribute to that one.
Yeah, so if I may, hope can you actually hear me, because none of you are actually moving on my screen.
Yeah, I can hear
I
you.
can hear you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so in terms of Section 106 funding, obviously we endeavour to collect all the Section 106 contributions, and obviously as part of the capital strategy update report that's going to council in February, it gives an update on the position in terms of how much that funding we've used and how much is left to allocate. But in answer to the specific question, yes, we do we endeavour to obviously collect all the Section 106 monies that are due.
Is there a way where councillors of the area can get details of how much Section 106 is collected and what are they going to be used for?
So yes, absolutely, it's in the capital programme update report. So we can provide that information.
Okay, just one observation from the reports I'd make, as no one else has brought it up, is that there's a requirement to recruit 4 extra staff. But
Yeah.
I just wondered, one, if we couldn't get the staff, would that completely blow the thing apart? And following on from that, on Councillor McCormick's point, is if we get all our plans together, is the market got the resource to do all the building projects that we might need?
Yeah, it's good questions. In terms of the staff, yes, we do need them, especially if we're delivering on the sustainability agenda. We recruit in, for example, in the operations team within property, mechanical and engineering surveyor, which will be sort of key in sort of the heating side of the various buildings we've got in the operations portfolio, and sort of a number of building surveyors to sort of implement the process. Additionally, on the investment side, in order to sort of achieve deals like we've done on the James Close with St Modwyn's, we try to replicate those transactions, which are very resource heavy in terms of staff hours. And yes, we to deliver the anticipated sort of receipts and returns, we do need them. We also running on sort of a number of interims at the moment, which are particularly an expensive way of sort of delivering, and so full-time positions as well will result in some savings there. The second question in relating to sort of supply chains and are the people out there to deliver, it is challenging. There's building cost inflation, which is putting pressure on schemes, but you know, things are getting a bit better, and we sort of anticipate that those problems easing up as COVID hopefully recedes. But it is a risk nevertheless.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions regarding item 6? In which case, thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
We'll move on to agenda item 7. We're certainly getting our money's worth from you tonight, Sue, as it's you again.
Me again.
I would like to make a comment there. It's a shame Councillor Isaac isn't with us, because it looks a bit as if it's like us against Sue, as opposed to us against Sue and the cabinet. You know? So thank you very much for that. So over to you for the capital investment strategy.
I think Councillor James has got his hand up, or has it gone down?
It was only to say that I just want to distance myself from the remark it's disappointing that Councillor Isaac is not here. It's never disappointing that Councillor Isaac is not here.
I think we'll strike that from the record, they say, isn't it? They do that on television. Thank you so much for your input, Councillor James. Right, over to you, Sue.
So this report obviously covers the capital investment strategy, which sits alongside the next report, which is the Treasury management strategy. So we have a requirement under the Prudential Code of Practice to have an annual capital investment strategy alongside the prudential indicators and limits relating to capital expenditure. And it looks at affordability, external debt and investments. The Council is also required by investment guidance issued by the Ministry of Housing, well, actually it's DLUC now, but DLUC's predecessor, to have an annual investment strategy for non-treasury investments. Both of these strategies must be approved by full council before the start of the financial year, and they must be published on the council's website. So this report sets out the capital investment strategy for 22-23 and the investment strategy non-treasury also 22-23. So the intention is that the capital investment strategy is a high-level overarching strategy that sits on top of and brings together in summary form all of the council's capital spending plans and the council's various investment strategies over the medium-term financial planning period, in this case up to 25-26. The annual capital investment strategy will also be used to set the statutory 4-year prudential indicators, including an authorised limit for external debt and the annual minimum revenue provision MRP statement in accordance with requirements of the Prudential Code of Practice. The capital investment strategy is supported by the capital programme strategy and the Treasury management strategy and linked investment strategy non-treasury. So all of those are going to council in February. The investment strategy non-treasury brings together and summarises all of the council's non-treasury investment strategies. So these could be for service-based investments and investment properties. For this council, this means it sits alongside the Treasury management strategy and is supported by the council's property investment strategy. So the capital strategy itself is largely unchanged from previous years and provides information on the council's capital spending plans, notes the income streams and how they're going to be used. The council has no external borrowing, but does need to have a minimum revenue provision statement and a borrowing strategy in case it does intend to borrow. The current limit for borrowing is £50 million. There are currently no plans for external borrowing. The report also covers the statutory prudential indicators that we are required to report on, and it notes the links to the TM strategy, which obviously is later on the agenda. In terms of the non-treasury investment strategy, as I've already said, it covers all the financial assets and also non-financial assets held primarily to generate income, i.e. investment property. And there are two main changes to this particular strategy. So the first one links into the SAMP that we've just discussed, and that is the property investment strategy. So as already noted, that there is a self-funding scheme of up to £40 million to meet the intended review of all of our asset management. And the intended return or the expected return on that is a weighted average of 5.5%. That 5.5% additional income return has been built into the revenue budget and the MTFS that's also going to council in February. The other thing that we have looked at is the Many Down project, where there is an opportunity for us alongside Hampshire County Council to invest in the senior infrastructure funding. And we are looking to invest up to £25 million in the infrastructure funding, which is in essence a loan to the company, of which we will get a minimum return of 2.6%. What I would say is that the intention is, having reviewed the Treasury management holdings that we have, two of the funds that have obviously been identified this evening by Arlene Close as our lower performing funds we will look to actually disinvest those funds and use that funding to meet the funding on the infrastructure funding for Manydown. And therefore, whilst this is not a treasury management investment at that point, it is still an alternative investment strategy. So these two main items, i.e. the property investment strategy and the Manydown senior infrastructure funding, are detailed in section 4 and 6 of that particular strategy. So that was what I was going to say, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, has anyone got any observations or comments? I note that on the front sheet, we're being asked to recommend to council. There's 2 points. I'd say one is fairly straightforward because that's really governed by SIPFA and the various regulations, so that's really a technical issue. And point 2 is to recommend to council the investment strategy non-treasury, because treasury comes in the next item agenda. So are there any points, observations? Councillor James.
Yeah, it always frightens me. Obviously, one of the biggest expenditures we're likely to face in terms of capital over the next couple of years is the leisure park, the aquadrome in particular. We're talking tens of millions on that. Money that doesn't come back, it's not an investment. It can't be argued as an investment in terms of it will fund services. It's money that you put into something to serve the people, and in 40 years' time, it's pretty much valueless, and you've got to start all over again. Now, in business, we obviously had depreciation. There's a line on our accounts. And even this council, we used to always set aside £500,000 or whatever it was, and every year from the revenue would go into capital, knowing that there's going to be big schemes coming up every couple of years that we'll need to throw a lot of money at that we're not going to get back. The current strategy seems to be a sole dependence on 106 and SIL monies, and perhaps a government grant every so often. I'm not sure we're top of the levelling up agenda priority list for Michael Gove in his long kept report, which is sitting there in the in tray just underneath Sue Gray's. What is the strategy? I mean, we can make some great decisions as councillors now, but in 40 years' time, what's in this strategy tells me we're in a good place in 40 years' time. The next generation of councillors will still be able to replace the aquadrome that we built. They'll be able to do the things that we've had the luxury of doing. Because I'm just worried that it's not in there, in that strategy.
Sue, do you want to make a comment?
Chair, if I may, just to clarify, the committee is being asked to consider and comment on the draft capital investment strategy. I think you read out the council recommendations.
All right.
So this is just for comment and consideration. So in that point, Councillor James, what we're talking about is actually covered in the capital strategy, which is part of the capital programme update, which is going to Cabinet next week and on to Council in February. It absolutely looks at the horizon scanning in terms of all the potential things that might be coming forward in terms of those things that may need capital funding. We will have to take that into consideration in terms of future funding requests. Which is one of the reasons why we do put the borrowing strategy in, even though we have no need to externally borrow at the current time. There is an annual contribution from revenue to capital, and at the end of the current capital programme period, there's circa, I think it's about £16 million worth of revenue contributions to capital and a further £16 million worth of capital receipts. That are not yet allocated to the capital programme at the end of 25-26. So there is an appreciation that there are going to be some large chunky requirements coming forward. But at the current time, we obviously need to quantify those and understand what the ask is and prioritise them.
Councillor James, you've still got your hand up. Did you want to come back on that? Oh, right.
No, I just wanted to find out how to take it down again.
Oh, okay, well done. Councillor McCormick, I think you were next.
Thank you, Chair. Just craving your indulgences. So am I right in thinking that let's look at Appendix 1, Table 1, page 114. You've got a big lot of service-based capital expenditure, home improvement, financial assistance, disabled facilities grants, etc., etc. These appear to be one-offs. I would have thought things like disabled facilities grants, we'd have an ongoing need for that, but it seems to have tailed off. So that's my first question. Second one, table 2. It appears that our asset sales, we've got a big stream coming online with many down, but we don't appear to be doing very much for many down other than prep work. And I think there is one planning application in around Worthing House. So what's the risk of those slipping to the right? And then table 3, there's a big estimate there of 30 million. And I wasn't quite sure. I think that again is many down. If somebody could confirm that for me. Thank you.
Right.
Excuse me. Apologies, I did cut out slightly there, but hopefully I heard it all. Can you hear me?
We missed a few seconds there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep. So in terms of the disabled facility grants, they get added in each year as part, but obviously we confirm that each year when we get the actual grant figure. In terms of table 2, obviously the report does note that we don't include anything, for example, from the major developments to do with SIL at the current time. So once we understand when they'll be received, they'll be added into the programme. And apologies, that's where I cut out, so I wasn't sure whether that was what you asked. And the 30 million contributions in 22-23 is a combination of the property investment strategy disposals and also an accounting entry, which is effectively the land drawdown on many down. Did anyone get that?
Everyone okay?
I think I got at least part of it. I wasn't quite sure about table 2.
I can. Do you want to just reaffirm what your question was, Councillor McCormick?
Well, it's just the risk of the figures in table 2 shifting rightwards because, well, not wanting to rake over old coals, but it's taken us 25 years to get to the point where we've just done the survey work on many down and have the first detailed application in. So I'm not altogether sure how that money vests to us, whether it's on completion of homes or occupancy of homes, or whether we get cash up front from developers. What's the risk that it will shift rightwards and we don't get that 12 million in the next financial year?
So those asset sales are not many down itself. It's many down drawdown, and then it's the asset disposals to do with property investment strategy. The current MTFS does not include any of the income the capital receipts that we will be receiving from many down, because they come in just in the following year. So we would expect to start building that in next year when we add another year onto the MTFS.
Okay. Councillor Tustain, you've got your hand up.
I have indeed, Chair. Thank you. This is more sort of a generalist thing, and I apologise to those of you that are very knowledgeable on all these things, because many of you here also understand the background a lot more and have a lot more experience in this area than me. But one of the things we talked about earlier was about the idea of being risk averse and trying to move away from being quite so risk averse. And I just wondered, you talked about, so there's no plans for external borrowing. Obviously, we don't particularly need it, but obviously we're looking to do some quite major regeneration as far as like the leisure park, for example, and the town centre. Are we taking a sort of a view and actually having a look at the potential whether or not doing a bit of prudent external borrowing would actually help things at all? Because I know obviously we've got the budget coming up and things are really tight, and we're just seeing everything tight. I know Hampshire obviously is struggling as well with this. So are we sort of actually going to be a little bit more sort of take the ball by the horns, and do we consider this?
So at the current time, we have no need to borrow. We have significant capital. We have circa £45 million worth of capital funding still available at the end of the current capital programme in 25-26. So the reason we have a borrowing policy, if you like, and a policy that's linked to that, which is the minimum revenue provision, which is kind of the capital side of the repayment rather than the interest side. We put those into the strategy on the expectation that we may well have to borrow. So effectively, we're preparing ourselves and putting in place the policies that allow us to do it. But at the current time, we haven't had any schemes come forward that require us to do so. And obviously, as a council, we will do what we call internal borrowing first, i.e. we use our own resources up before we look to pay debt charges on external borrowing. But we're gearing ourselves up so that we've got the ability to do so if we need to.
So just a supplementary on that then. So if things come out of the consultations and the sort of about the leisure park, for example, and there's a public appetite for some particular sort of facility, for example, would we then consider borrowing if we didn't have quite enough money to cover it? I can see Councillor Putty shaking his head.
So all I can say is that the policy allows us to. It will be a political decision as to whether that's what you wanted to do.
Thank you.
It's worth pointing out that the prudential indicators or prudential treasury management indicators, so I think they're now called, require us to put that sort of thing in, even though we don't need it. But that's all part of the regulatory requirement. Councillor Poland, your hand is up.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just ask Sue, you mentioned the interest rate, minimum interest rate, I believe, was at 2.9%. Who actually sets that? What's it based on, given that, of course, that is significantly below maybe the rate of inflation when the loan goes through?
We are currently in commercial negotiations in terms of what that rate's likely to be. So it's the minimum likely to be is 2.6 rather than 2.9. But obviously we are currently discussing heads of terms in terms of what that rate is going to look like. And it will be governed by the whether we have to take into consideration risk, state aid, security, etc. So we're just stating the minimum we can get at the moment. Obviously, we'll be looking to work with the Many Down Development Vehicle. So in this case, that's a separate company to the authority in terms of what that overall interest return will be. But that is because we're doing it as an alternative investment strategy. 2.6% is actually significantly higher than we have or believe we can achieve necessarily on some funds under the Treasury Management Strategy.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've probably done that one enough justice, because we now move on to item 8, which is the interesting chestnut of the Treasury Management Strategy for 22-23. And I wonder who's presenting this one.
I wonder. Well, you know, it's my time of year when you've got lots of Section 151 reports coming through. It's great fun. So obviously this is kind of building on the introductory piece of work, obviously from Arlene Close earlier in the meeting. And effectively the Treasury Management Strategy is obviously this evening is the draft strategy. And again, looking to the committee to for any comments for that to feed to Council as part of their deliberation in terms of the overall strategy. So the strategy itself sets the overall limits and the parameters within which the operation delivery activity operates. So Council sets the policy, officers obviously then work within the policy to implement the Treasury Management Strategy. So the strategy sets the absolute limits, but does not set the actual asset allocation under those limits or the fund manager selection. Those decisions are my responsibility as Section 151 officer. But if there was any significant change to the strategy, it would need further council approval. So I can't change the strategy. All I can do is operate within the strategy that the council approves. So the core elements of the 22-23 Treasury Management Strategy are obviously to maintain a balanced and a diversified portfolio, which has the flexibility to respond to changes in interest rate environment. It's also to invest surplus funds prudently. And the council's priorities are security of invested capital, liquidity of invested capital, and to achieve an optimum yield which is commensurate with the security and liquidity. So just coming back to the code requires us to do it in that order. So we have to work within those parameters. Clearly, we have to record any borrowing limits that provide for financing opportunities, which comes back to Councillor Tasmane's point, in that we have to make provision for it, but we don't necessarily have to use it. And to minimise the cost of any temporary borrowing. So that would, for us, that would only be for cash flow purposes, but actually we have a sufficient cash flow that we don't need to do that generally. But again, the strategy has to allow us to be able to do that. So the council's objective when investing money is to strike an appropriate balance between risk and return. And again, Arlene Close have noted that earlier this evening. And obviously we want to minimise the risk of incurring losses from defaults and the risk of receiving unsuitably low investment income. So absolutely categorically, I can't stress it enough, it really is about risk versus reward. And as an authority, the approach in the past has been to be very risk averse. As officers, we are obviously listening to yourselves as members in terms of wanting to see a higher return. The offset of that is actually the acceptance of the higher risk. So when you read through the strategy, you will note that it actually talks about the fact that we can have this wider flexibility within the strategy. We can look to make further improvements in terms of our returns on investments, but we still need to be prudent in terms of looking at the risk. When we're looking at the treasury management risk, we're actually looking at the risk across all investments. So I would look at the property investment strategy, the treasury management strategy, the capital investment strategy, and actually look at where does that risk lie across all the assets that we might be investing in. So on page 138 of the report pack, it notes the key changes to both the treasury management policy statement, which is appendix 1 to the report, and the treasury management strategy, which is appendix 2 to the report. And the committee have previously asked for a clear indication of the changes that have been made, and that is detailed on that page. We obviously have the option of doing a track change, but because there are actually limited number of changes, it's about more appropriate to give you a clean copy of the actual strategy and indicate where those updates have happened. I think the main overall change throughout the whole strategy is to introduce the environment, social and governance, ESG investing, which is expanding on the previous ethical investing criteria that we had. The updated CITFA Code of Practice has been updated to include a requirement to have due regard to ESG investing. And the policy states that as a council, we will give preference to funds that are managed by investment managers that have signed up as active members of the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative or the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, whilst being considerate, of course, the potential financial returns. That also links to a number of government initiatives in terms of what they're calling greening finance. And they have a roadmap as well that looks at how they will be asking financial institutions to move towards being able to offer to investors like ourselves investments that actually help us to achieve the climate change agenda. As I noted earlier, we can confirm as officers that our current external funds are all signed up to one of these initiatives. And as we've already noted, a very nominal sum is held in one market money fund, which actually, when it expires, we will place the actual fund, and it's only £100,000. We will invest it with another money market fund. So we have been able to get those assurances already, and in terms of our future investments, we will ensure that they are signed up to one of these initiatives. In the main, purely green investments tend to be equity investments, which don't actually form part of our current treasury management strategy. So actually, as part of updating this strategy, obviously it's one of the funds that we're now looking to include, so that actually it gives us the opportunity to look at some of the green initiatives that are actually on the market for us to invest in. There are a couple of other key changes to the strategy. So the first one is obviously, as noted by Stephen earlier, is the addition of the equity funds and Reits, because that actually just gives us a bit more flexibility to achieve higher returns. We have removed the previous repo agreements. Arlene Close asked us to put that in as a method of investing some years ago, but actually the opportunities have never materialised, and therefore we wish to take them out of the strategy. Previously as well, we've had an overall fund limit of £120 million. For transparency, we've now actually broken that down into individual limits for each type of fund. It doesn't exceed the 120 million, but actually for transparency, it gives you some assurance in terms of making sure that we're having a spread of investment activity. And then one other minor sort of technical problem really is that there is a suggestion that we should now refer to diversified credit funds and absolute return bonds as bond funds instead. So we want to combine those two activities into bond funds. The term was used by our previous advisors and is no longer used commonly within the market. They're actually referred to as bond funds. So as I've noted, the committee has previously expressed concerns regarding the overall level of Treasury management investment returns and have sought to have less risk-averse approach to investment. Hopefully the introduction of both equity funds and Reits will add up greater potential for returns, but obviously will introduce greater volatility in those returns as well as greater risk. The strategy reiterates the need for a balance of investment across Treasury management capital and investment, including property investment strategy. And section 10 of the report provides a summary of the outcome of our Treasury advisors' annual review of the current Treasury management strategy, the Treasury investment portfolio and investment criteria as at the end of September. The review was carried out in December, and as actually one of the things it has highlighted is the fact that we do have a couple of external funds that we may wish to review. That's obviously linked to the review that we will then invest in many down instead. I would apologise, there are a couple of typos and formatting requirements that will be corrected for the council version. And what I would also say is that the draft strategy that's come to this committee this evening has to be published before we actually finalise the capital programme. So we will need to update some of the numbers in the report before it goes to council, just for the final changes on the capital programme strategy. So whilst you're responsible for determining the strategy, the committee is asked to provide views on the proposed strategy for consideration by council and in agreeing the strategy within the responsibility for scrutiny and monitoring of the Treasury management function. So I would be very grateful for any comments that you have that we can obviously feed into that discussion with council. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sue. That was a marathon. Well done. Members, Councillor James.
Thank you, Chair. I want to welcome particularly the idea that we're actually going to invest in green technology, potentially through the other funds, which is something that if only we'd done 20 years ago or 15 years ago when it was good money, would be marvellous, but we didn't. And I think you're right in the sense that we've always taken a very cautious view in this council. And I know that the financial crash scared a lot of people, but we've always gone not only with caution with investments and going for the safest possible return, minimal return, let's go safe. At the same time, we've managed our own risk reserves. We've had interest rate risk reserves, which always seems a strange thing when interest rates were 0.01% or whatever they were. I mean, where could they go from there, really? But I think I like the idea of going bigger on investments and being a bit bolder, a bit braver, a bit more adventurous, because we are in a position where we can. But I don't want anyone to think that having moaned about the council for not being ambitious with its investments and moaning about the council having its great big stack of risk reserves, that we use both. If we're going to go a bit bolder and braver on the investments, that's when you have that risk reserve. And I appreciate the diversification of our investments means those bonds are going to sit there quite safe. So even if we go and, spend money on a cabbage farm and it rains all year or whatever, we don't get any cabbages, doesn't matter. I'm sure you wouldn't. But, I just think we've got to get the balance right. And I think we're moving towards getting that balance right, but let's not blow the risk reserves, because if we're going to take risks, then we need those risk reserves. We just should never have had both, because that was lots and years of lost opportunity.
Anyone else? Councillor Poland.
Thank you, Chair. I endorse the previous comments, and as one who sat on this committee since last year, I've also concerned myself as to the returns, the negative returns in real rates that we're getting, but equally in going to a slightly more riskier basis. I equally wouldn't want to be jumping completely onto the other side of the fence, given where we are with market volatility, interest rates on the rise, and all of that moves into equity markets. It would be the wrong time, potentially. Maybe the time to done it was 2 years ago, but we are where we are. So hindsight's wonderful, as they say. The only thing I didn't really understand from the comment from Arlington was why we can't use ETFs. Maybe that's for another day.
Yeah, so just to follow that up, so what that means is that we have to treat it as capital expenditure. And because it's the same as effectively buying a building, if you like, depending on how we fund that activity, we may then have to actually generate an additional reserve, an additional return. The Prudential Code makes it quite difficult for us to invest in those types of activity. So what the code does is actually certain activities, so for example, the CCLA Property Fund, they allow us to treat that as non-capital expenditure. So there are certain investments that they make it easy for us to invest in. Other investments are more difficult to invest in because actually they don't see that it's necessarily appropriate that local authorities should be investing in them. But if it's helpful, Councillor Poland, I can give you a written response on that.
Thank you, Chair, if I may. Yeah, because as I'm sure Sue knows, an ETF is only virtually an equities fund and a very low cost, basically is a passive fund that tracks a tracker, if you'll pardon the expression.
Okay, has anybody else got a comment on this? Sue started off it. The changes are beautifully summarised at the beginning, and there's nothing in there that's desperate apart from the welcome change to more flexibility in the investments that we may make in the future. Okay, well, if there's no other comments, we'll move on to the next item, which is item 9. Am I correct there, Ellie? I think so. And now for something.
That's right.
Now for something completely different. Thank you so much, Sue, for that. That was a big session. So we got what is it? The data protection. Who's picking this one? Anne, are you picking this one up?
Chair.
Okay, over to you, Anne.
Thank you. So this report relates to a data breach that we had when we managed to disclose some vehicle registration numbers quite a lot in our disclosure log. And the disclosure log is a document that we use to put up all our replies to Freedom of Information requests. Normally, you wouldn't think a vehicle registration number would be particularly sensitive because they're on your cars and they're sort of public, but it was the quantity that was disclosed that made us decide to report this to the ICO. So the ICO responded and they decided that they didn't need to take any further action. They made a number of recommendations that are set out in the report at the end of paragraph 2.1, and departments have been instructed not to disclose vehicle registration numbers in future, and we're working our way through the recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly straightforward, and we've obviously got a template answer back from the ICO saying thank you for letting us know. But you know, it's not like previous breaches, so I think that can we take that as read, as it were? Thank you, Anne.
Agreed.
Yeah. But it'll be back now on the social net item 10. So I guess that's you again, Anne.
Yes, Chair, this is the standard report that you get at each committee. As you'll see, we haven't actually had to view any social networking sites at all for the period from the 1st of November to the 31st of December. So there's not much to report on this occasion.
Yeah. I mean, there's basically nothing to report, is there? Because there's been nothing since July. So, okay, take that as read. Yep.
Agreed. We should really let Anne go first next time before Sue, I think.
Well, yeah, Ellie, maybe we should look at the agenda, because this always happens with the poor people at the end get 30 seconds having been there for a couple of hours. So that then takes us on to our last item, item 11, which is just the list of the provisional reports for the next committee, which is the 28th of March, which will be the last meeting of this Parliament or council. Has anyone got any comments on that, or it's just standard stuff? Oh, Sue, you've got your hand up.
I've been quiet for so long. Just to note that actually we'll be looking to try and move the date of Audit and Accounts Committee for March, because it actually falls in the pre-election period. Not that there are any decisions to make, but it'd be appropriate for us to move the session.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. So it won't be the 28th of March then. Okay, so only leaves item 12, exclusion of press and public. Well, that's not necessary. No confidential exempt items for information. So that brings us to the end of the committee meeting. Thank you all. Ah, Sue, you've got your hand up.
No.
And Dan, sorry.
Yeah, Sue, you go first.
I was just going to ask committee if they would record their thanks to Suzanne Jones. This is her last meeting with us before she moves on to her next opportunity. So I'd like to say a massive thank you to Suzanne, who has put an extraordinary amount of effort into the reports that come to this committee.
Absolutely.
Yeah, here. Yeah, we'll miss you, Suzanne. It's a great shame.
Yeah, well done, Suzanne.
You know, best of luck wherever you're off to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure working with you all. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Putty, you had your hand up.
Yes, Chairman, this is to go to Ellie Cole mainly. Why don't I get my connection for audit and accounts? Because I always seems to be looking for it and wasting a lot of time. Like today, near more than half an hour I've been, and I thank Samir for helping me out on that. But I never got the link how to join the meeting.
Yeah,
So,
Councillor Putty, you sent your apologies for this meeting, so that's why you didn't receive a link.
oh, right. Oh, yeah, because I should have been in Australia, but I am not. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Well, that solves that mystery.
Lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.